Hello and welcome to Insight Live, the IT Experts Take, where we give you the opinion of experts in their field on the technologies that accelerate your business. Today, we're going to be talking about staying ransomware ready, and I've got a couple of guys teed up to talk to us about this. We have Chris Kapusta, who is a practice manager, and Clay Huckendorf, who is a senior architect with me here at Insight, and I'm Jason Rader. Welcome back. Glad everybody's back after the new year. Welcome back to you two, who have also been on the show before.
Great to be here. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, Clay, we're in the same town, but we couldn't be together today, so maybe next time.
For sure.
So, how do we kick off a ransomware discussion? Here I'll start it off with an interesting kind of anecdote. So we had, hopefully it's interesting. We were going to do a survey on ransomware. Actually, we attempted to do a survey on ransomware, but as we usually do our surveys on LinkedIn, if you produce a survey that says, was your organization affected by a ransomware in 2022, when people are using their LinkedIn accounts to comment on that, they typically, so everybody who responded to the survey said no. So my expectation is that everybody who maybe literally wasn't affected by ransomware did say no, but there were 90% of other people that would have responded didn't want that linked to their LinkedIn profile. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wish the answer was no, because this would be a very short session and we could just all move on. But, unfortunately, everything we're seeing, everything the industry's seeing, everything the world's seeing is this is continuing to be a problem, that the fad has not yet kind of lost interest or gone away. And unfortunately, the numbers to remediate, the insurance premiums, the cost of getting hit by ransomware, we see those kind of growing almost exponentially. Not to overuse that, but it's still definitely a big problem. Clay, I know you've had a lot of experience with this in 2022. Would love your take.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and what we're starting to see now is it's kind of that evolution of ransomware, right? I think a number of years ago it was protecting a single workstation, and if that got affected, it was really isolated to that one workstation, and then you started to see some lateral movements within the environment, which has now turned into, what we've been talking about for the last number of years is, locking everything down and demanding a ransom. And now it's starting to evolve again to, it's not so much just to be destructive, but, potentially exfiltrating data, right? So how do you look at the big picture and layer different security measures in place to account for, that single instance, but then also, not only have to worry about recovering your data, but making sure that our data is safe and not leaving the building when we don't want it to.
Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit, because, and maybe everybody's aware, but I want to at least cover it for those who aren't. Exfiltrating data from the organization and the extortion that potentially happens after that. Why don't you guys walk me through that? What's the motivation there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think as we saw kind of ransomware mature, we also saw the response to ransomware mature. So the I'm going to encrypt all of your data, hold it hostage for a ransom to give you those decryption keys. We saw a lot of organizations really focus on ransomware recovery. How do I firm up my data protection environments to make sure A, they're safe from ransomware, but B, when and if that incident does occur, I can recover without having to pay that ransom. So as that started to mature, we saw the bad actors say, okay, let's take this to the next level. I'm not going to encrypt your data. I'm just going to steal it and hold it hostage. If I have a copy somewhere in a cloud, somewhere locally outside of your perimeter defenses, and now I can hold that hostage and say, hey, pay me, or I send this to your competition, I make it public, whatever the ultimate end game is there. We kind of see that as the next evolution is it's not just encryption, it's now stealing and holding hostage.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think so many people focused on a lot of people on the very early onset from a ransomware perspective refused to pay the ransom out of principle. Obviously government agencies suggested to never support, paying it at a certain point in time. But a lot of people found out early on that, wow, we didn't really have a good program in place to be able to restore, or it takes a really long time. And, it turned out that the ransomware folks had pretty good support on getting your stuff decrypted. Otherwise, the whole thing would fall apart. So they kind of invested in that. But I think because there's regulations, as a chief information security officer myself and working a lot with those types, the regulations that are out in the US and the EU, pretty much everywhere, even if you are content to pay the ransom, that information being exfiltrated from the organization, depending on what type of information it is, sometimes they did it to prove that they did it, or just to kind of dig at the organization, or to use as a negotiation tactic. But, now it's one of those things where, all right, we're going to post this in our, PR website, and it'll be a legitimate disclosure. Now, from a legal perspective, as a CISO, if that happened, the bad guys always say, well, we'll promise if you pay the ransom that we're not going to tell anybody that we stole your stuff. We'll have our promise that we're not even going to attack you anymore. And, I want to believe something like that, but I have no doubt that that's not the case. And I think it's this weird back and forth, but it basically means that the ransomware folks are going to get paid, probably, or it's a better way for them to get paid and trying to figure this out.
Right.
Any comments related to that?
So I think, what you just kind of spelled out, I mean, is exactly what we're seeing, right? It's the, whether it's, giving out proprietary data, right? So you've got kind of the tease, if it were, right? We have your data and this is the little bit that we're going to show, but we're holding back the rest. But the reality is some of that data, aside from your internal, teammates and your clients, your data is your most important asset, right? And you have, proprietary or IP data that, if that gets out, that can be very damaging to your business. Maybe some contractual agreements, maybe there are some items that, if were to be made public, might cause additional scrutiny from regulatory or legal bodies, right? So I think it's the evolution of ransomware has churned where it's no longer where we're being very defensive. We have to really be focused on maybe playing a little bit of offense. So instead of us, I think most people understand that having immutable backups or a worm copy or things that are indelible and really protecting kind of that safe or that vault of your data. But how do we make sure that, once somebody is in, and quite frankly, people are getting in at an alarming rate, how do we make sure that the data is staying intact, right? How do we monitor for that? How do we make sure that, when data is leaving, that we're able to stop it and capture and isolate it as soon as possible? The best example that I have of this is I had a customer that did get hit with ransomware, and thankfully they were able to recover their data. And when they went to triage what had occurred, they were able to go and walk back through logs and through different tool sets, and they discovered that these bad actors had been in for 9 months. And when somebody had mentioned that, they finally found kind of ground zero or day zero of when this occurred, somebody stood up and said, we've had all this data for 9 months. And we weren't able to do anything over the course of the 9 months. So, and I think that's really a telling, or maybe that's the next evolution of organizations maturing their security posture is, we likely have some of this data or are getting some of this information. How do we get it into a tool set that can help us to aggregate it and then decipher it, right? Because I think that's a lot of the problem is we may know or have some data that shows that somebody got in, but we don't have a very good way of executing a plan to get them pushed out or to see where else they are. So,
now that's you bring up a really interesting point, and it's not like there was a log somewhere that said bad guy got in and nobody looked at that log, right? It's all of this aggregated information, and then we all of a sudden learn about a certain vector or a certain vulnerability that's in the environment that we then trace back to that point. You know what I'm saying? But think about this. The majority of logging is 90 days. It's one of those things where if this was 9 months ago, we might never get to that root cause if we're just only having 90 days worth of logs, which, that again affects our ability to do that detection. Because a lot of the time, you're right. We figure out how bad guys can get in months, hopefully days, but months after they get in. How do we, because that could be a travesty if they hadn't have done any ransomware activities. And I really believe that bad guys who did whatever they wanted finally turned it over to another crew that finally that executed the ransomware part of that, because there's a lot of that stuff goes on in that community. So how do we, it's about having that information that we can go back, get the appropriate threat intelligence, parse that information, and then be able to come up to something. But that's threat hunting, that's a lot of, there's got to be a lot of fire prevention that's got to make that happen instead of just fighting fires. And
Right.
and I think that's, when people just want to talk about ransomware, when we're talking to clients, we got to expand that conversation to your point, Clay, is that's got to be more of a, how do we keep these guys out? How do we not just detect, or not, how do we just respond to that ransomware news, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and I think Clay's point on going on the offense is really important now, because we've obviously spent years now fortifying our perimeters, making sure they're safe. Now we're starting to see a lot of these SaaS applications that clients are consuming. We're starting to see code repositories hacked. Code repositories that they think are private. We don't know what they contain yet because they're private. The disclosures of what this has now opened, we probably won't see for weeks or months, if not longer. So Clay's got an excellent point there. It's no longer just protecting our four walls. We've got to be a little bit more diligent because of all these new services that we're consuming. We're putting a lot of trust in those that they're not going to be compromised in some way. And some of the recent news has been very discouraging, and kind of what's been compromised. Source code's been leaked, and nobody knows the full extent of what's in there yet. So the need to detect, the need to really look at what's going on in our environment and respond to it before we get to before we get to that critical point of a cyber attack is becoming more and more important.
Great point. And I think there's a lot of governance, those kinds of code repositories. Nobody just puts their code repository out there for people to get. And usually it's one of those things where we've got to do our DevOps, our DevSecOps appropriately to deal with that. If we've got people who are brilliant at writing code that are also responsible for those repositories, and it's kind of separate from the information security side of the organization, I mean, it's real easy to mark a private repository public. It's literally a keystroke. And that's and there's all kinds of, even if it's not bad guys, there's tons of folks out there that are, or agents out there that are just copying, cloning public repositories all day long. So whether you wanted it out there or not, and that's a disclosure again, back to that other thing. So it's a programmatic approach, including your DevOps, including all of these things to really, that investment, it's not a sexy thing to talk about. Let's build the program more. Ransomware is a headline grabber, but let's talk about our program in general and how we need to do the procedures properly and have the right auditable controls in place. That's not sexy, but it's really what makes the program work.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I kind of relate it back to when public cloud really started to take off. We'd see news story after news story of those storage buckets that were created and left open to the public, and because the people writing the code, the people doing those applications may not have a security background, and that's okay. They don't have to. But to your point, Jason, it really speaks to the need to build that program, to build that team around our to add the sec to DevOps for DevSecOps, and make sure that security is paramount in everything we do. And let those that do have that expertise, do have that background, really help along the way, secure those objects, secure those endpoints, whatever the case may be, because recovering from an incident, not just financially, not just operationally, but also your reputation, is a heck of a lot harder than putting those programs in up front and securing all of that up front.
So Clay, since we titled the title of this, Staying Ransomware Ready, what are some of the, because obviously it's always great if you're starting from a clean slate. Nobody is, though. What do you find that's kind of the typical motion when you go into a client? It's probably more reactive than proactive, I would guess.
Sure. Yep.
But what do you kind of, assuming that you've stopped the hemorrhage of data and you've dealt with the unavailability of the data and the resources, how would you consult with a client at that point?
Yeah, I mean, it's a conversation that we have, quite frankly, every day, right? It's, ransomware has now been in the news for, while not new, it's certainly been in the news quite a bit over the last couple of years. So we're always getting questions on what can we be doing better, or, what are things we should be thinking about? And I think, Jason, you brought up a very good point is, having that structure, that governance in place early and out of the gate, and being able to expand that to whether we are still in our data center, we've got things in the public cloud, or we're leveraging, as a service for some applications. I think having a structure in place and a framework that we can continue to expand for the various workloads and the various clouds that we may be operating in is very important. But we see things like, multi-factor authentication, right? That, I think for a lot of people that's a very, very easy entry point into helping to defend and secure the environment, making sure that we've got some worm storage within the environment, making sure that we're adding as many layers. Patching is another one that, the client that I referenced before, they had an unpatched firewall, and that's how they were able to get into that environment. And you think of something as simple as patching, but it is still an area where we see a deficiency in a lot of organizations. So, having that framework and that governance in place that we're applying to our entire infrastructure, again, whether it's in our data center, devices at the edge, IoT type devices, things in the cloud, that we're applying that governance and that same structure that we've always, tried to have within our four walls, that we're applying those best practices across all of those workloads.
You hit the nail. I think those two things that you just said, people are always talking about 0-day exploits and all these things. No, usually these guys are getting into stuff that was like 3 or 4 years old, sometimes 10. And I think so that simple thing, how to remain or how to be ransomware ready in 2023, any internet facing system, patch the heck out of that thing, right? Make sure that the schedule to patch those things, and obviously know about all of those things that are internet facing. Sometimes folks aren't necessarily aware of everything that is touching the internet.
Right.
And then your second, every one of these folks is getting in, unless there's some remote code exploit on a unpatched system, is getting in via an account within your environment. So MFA is literally the minimum thing you could do, I think, to kind of mitigate this risk. Yet there's a lot of folks, based on how they develop, a lot of people use service accounts, that's not an easy thing to accomplish, and other things like, I think that's again, kind of dealing with the tech debt that you've got in your organization. Those things will kind of hold you back, but so will a ransomware attack. So
Right.
It's one of those things you got to figure out, pay me now or pay me later, but that's going to have to happen.
Yep.
Okay. So where do we go from here? Do you see anything changing in the environment? So let's say we just made that definitive statement, do those things. Is there anything else? Because a lot of folks might say, yeah, we got hit with ransomware and we did those things. So now what do we do?
Yeah, I think some other areas we really need to focus on is we're seeing a lot more of the infrastructure, for lack of a better term, participate in that ransomware readiness action. We've harped on data protection quite a bit here and through other of these sessions, but storage devices are starting to analyze data that's being stored on them and participating and feeding that into SIEM and SOAR type of applications for logging and reporting. It really comes down to we have this data. Our data is everywhere now. It used to be in our data center. Now it's at the edge. It's in the cloud. It's in cars. It's in, you name it. There's data somewhere. We need better ways to aggregate what's going on with that data at all time. And we're really seeing the infrastructure start to participate in that. It really speaks to modernization. We've seen public cloud adoption take off because it's a modern platform. Excuse me. It's constantly updated. There's security, there's base level security policies in place. You're still responsible for your tenancy, but we often joke of the old applications that sit in a corner on outdated infrastructure and outdated operating systems, and nobody wants to touch it because who knows what's going to happen. And unfortunately, it's time to go fix it. Modernizing your infrastructure, modernizing your applications, getting rid of those security vulnerabilities that are just sitting out there, and getting a modern infrastructure that can participate in that ransomware posture will help quite a bit.
Totally agree. I think, you talked about something I want to counterpoint on, because sure. I think things like your storage environment, they can give a lot of great signal back, and a lot of folks aren't capturing that within their environment to be able to use. But also, I think a lot of those environments, which are kind of off the radar for the typical monitoring, like we don't do vulnerability scans against the the infrastructure as much as we do the endpoints and the servers, right? And that I found there's a lot of those devices that are not patched as much, and that potentially that's where the bad guys are staying to keep a foothold in an organization, because again, they're not scanned, they're not updated that much.
Every time I see someone brag about the uptime on a storage appliance or a backup environment, I cringe a little inside and say that just means you're unpatched. So, they are impressive, right? The hero numbers are impressive on uptime, but everyone go patch your systems.
Totally.
But Chris, I think you brought up the good point on modernizing the infrastructure. But it's not just the infrastructure or the widgets that we have sitting in the corner. It's the processes as well, right? And maturing what we're doing as an organization. And again, I kind of harp on that structure and that governance. But if we're not willing to invest in having that framework in place, we can patch all we want, which again, I think we all agree is a very good place to start. But you need to have that structure so that we don't, we're not talking about this 5 years from now about that, that same system now that is 5 years old and nobody's touched it. Yes, it fit the framework when we first put it in because we had that framework. But if we're not constantly maturing and updating that framework to account for, again, exfiltration of data is not really something that was on the radar from an industry perspective, or at least from in the context of ransomware, until just a few years ago. So we need to be constantly updating and maturing our environment.
So, and thank you. I love that. So it sounds like, and I'm playing kind of dumb here for a point, we need to have our development side of the organization, our InfoSec side of the organization, our infrastructure side of the organization, and our governance, compliance, and audit side of the organization all kind of be together on this. It's not something that can just be led by a single compartmentalized part of the organization.
No, this absolutely has to be a group effort. No, there can be central points of management and responsibility, but when you talk about who has to contribute to securing these environments and this data and even the response when something does occur, it has to be a response that crosses multiple silos. And I love Clay's point. It almost has to be like a product we develop internally. It is our product. Yeah. There is no, I deploy all of this, I'm now secure, everything's good, I can go focus on something else. We've got to go back and iterate because there's new vulnerabilities, there's new attack vectors, there's new ways bad actors are getting in, and we have to be able to respond and adapt to that. So I love that message.
Well, you make a good point, because if it is a product, there needs to be a product owner, which there needs to be all the rigor, like we would have a product owner, all of the things associated with something like that. And again, because just even if we had a good team that was working together, you do your part, you do your part, you do your part, there's something over the top of that's got to kind of take responsibility for it all. And I think that's, from a maturity perspective, that's where, organizations still have a ways to go in some cases. One of the, Clay, as you were talking just a minute ago, I thought, one of the best things about having to deal with ransomware is you've probably caught the attention of leadership, because if you're dealing with a ransomware event, because now they're very keen on mitigating this so that it never happens again, and in a response that they may have to have in their 10K or something along those lines, right?
Yeah, it's, I would say, over the last 2 years, I've unfortunately had the displeasure of being involved and seeing response plans and seeing how organizations are affected by a ransomware attack, right? And I think the more that I've seen it, not having a plan in place, and really that goes to notifying things like the legal department, or do we have to have a press release? I think that's something that us as IT folks, we don't really consider. But that is, going back to Chris's point, is making sure we've got buy-in from all different parts of the organization to, so you may have the infrastructure folks, the dev folks, the SecOps folks, but we also need people like the legal team involved, and they all need to be part of this response plan. And that was kind of one of the things that I really didn't consider is, sitting in these war rooms and we're restoring data, and somebody's like, do we need to put out a press release? right? Our systems are down. The one customer that I had mentioned, it happened to be during their peak season, right? So their ordering system was down. And when you've got people that are trying to order and your systems are down, they're going to start asking questions, right? And so it was just it was a unique perspective for me, being more of an infrastructure or a data center guy to start to learn that there's a much broader conversation that needs to happen, and it is people like legal and your PR firm that has to really be involved in this response.
Oh, I agree. That's the utmost in maturity of one of those plans, because the worst time to try to figure out what your plan is when you need to execute on that plan.
Yeah.
But I see it happen all the time. I'm sure you guys do as well.
Yeah, we almost have to treat it like we've done DR testing for decades now, failing between data centers to make sure we can resume business continuity, and we have to treat ransomware plans the same way, is practice them. To your point, Jason, the first time you go through it can't be during an event, because everything will go wrong. And it's not just identifying who has to be involved, but it's also who are their backups, and how do we get people access, and what if there's no environment to restore to? What if it's hardware that's compromised and now we have nothing that we can bring back online? It's all these unknowns that you have to plan for, and it can't be during an event to do that. Absolutely.
Yeah, and from that perspective, as a CISO, it's, even if you manage to recover from one of these events, you still have to disclose it usually, but your ability to articulate how you handled it is also under scrutiny, right? It's there's loss that's going to be associated with this, and if depending on clients and those kinds of things. So you always want to say, I followed the plan that we had in place. We followed those procedures meticulously, and everything worked in the way that we expected it to. You don't want to say, well, we figured it out, we got lucky. That's never going to look good, especially in a publicly traded organization. So it is one of those things, and it's devastating to organizations who get into a situation. It's hard to be in business anyway, but to have people attack your organization and keep you from doing the business that you want to do, and then state and government agencies coming at you afterwards, dealing with the disclosures and those kinds of things, that's a whole lot of legal that you didn't realize that you were going to have to deal with. So it can destroy an organization that really had a great business. But, so this can be very devastating. And it's one of those things where I don't like to use FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt in how we do what we do. But man, this is such a prevalent thing. And it's not just ransomware. It's regardless, people are getting in. Ransomware is something that they decide to do when they get in, but people are getting in. So don't put all your controls at the recovery from a ransomware event. Put them at the, identify and detect side, because it's way better to respond than it is to recover. Right.
And I think the other. Go ahead, Chris.
I was just gonna say, I always like to tell clients, if your recovery plan is just restore my data from backup, it's way too late. That's the point of last resort that we should always strive never to get to. So completely agree, is we need better upstream protection, monitoring, and response versus waiting till it gets to the point that I'm restoring data.
Yep.
And I think with regards to the plans, Chris, you brought it up. I mean, we've been doing DR and failovers for decades. And I think people, most organizations have a plan for, we lost a data center, right? They know what they're going to do. And I think, ransomware brings a whole new dynamic into the conversation, and there may be multiple plans for a response, right? If you're isolated to, say, a certain application, maybe we're closing the door and there's no no connection, and we're going to run isolated for X, or we've got a widespread that hit our production site and our DR site. There may be different response plans in place for, ransomware A, B, C, and D, right? And I think that's a very important thing, is we can't just take our DR plans for a site failure and just say that's now our ransomware plan. We really need to think about this, and things like tabletop exercises and kind of going down that wormhole of what about this and what about that, I think is a very useful exercise to understand these are the things that we're trying to account for, and they may all need their own individual response plans.
Love it. Yeah, I see in the more mature organizations that I'm talking to, the ransomware plan isn't a separate thing. It's part of the standard enterprise risk management. It's part of the standard crisis management. It's part of the incident response and BCDR plans that go in. It can't just be this thing, because then it kind of gets relegated to the technical side of the organization as opposed to the program side.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, it's been a cool conversation. We could probably go on for 45 more minutes or so, but
hours.
Yeah, easily. What, again, we might have scared some folks in what we're talking about. What let's give them something good to think about. What would that be? No, I'm just joking. So, first of all, what I do believe, once you do put that program in place, and I'll let you guys, actually, you go first. I'll come at the end. So why don't we start with Chris, go through Clay, and then I'll finish up.
Yeah, I would say when, looking on the bright side of life here, everything's becoming more mature in response to these problems. So it's, if you're just building a detection and response plan, or you're already down the path and continuing to iterate that, the good news is the industry as a whole is responding and things are getting more mature. Product sets and solutions are working better together to protect you. So I won't say I don't like to say it's a great time to be, to start developing a plan. That should have been last week, but the industry is definitely responding to help organizations combat this problem, detect this problem earlier in the cycle, and stay towards that preventative side that we've been discussing today. So, it's nice to see the industry really come together like that, and should help in a lot of the planning and protection and response.
From a ransomware perspective, and certainly just protecting the data, I think if we go back to, again, what we've been talking about for a number of years, there are a number of easy things that organizations can do to help protect their data, right? So it's, we talked a lot about governance and a plan and having this overarching idea, and organizations need to get there, but there are definitely things that we can do to be, as defensive as possible. And I think that's a great starting point, because that might be some of that easy button to help protect ourselves. But I think ultimately organizations do have to mature. They do have to get that structure and their governance in place, and really drive towards having that overarching plan in place, so that one, we know how to respond, but two, we can play a little bit more offense, and keep these guys out in the first place.
Oh, love it. And you guys stole mine now, but I think it might seem overwhelming, because we might have just taken some people out of where they feel very comfortable as we're talking about some of these programmatic things as opposed to the technology things. But the beautiful aspect of it is there are organizations like Insight, not so shameless of a plug, because it's true, that can take all of this tech and the consulting that would need to go and kind of bring this together into a program. Here's what I would tell any professional that's out there. I am certain that you've got smart people that can figure this out, but they have day jobs, and trying to get them to become experts at something, work with other folks in the organization to bring that program together. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I am saying it's going to take you longer than it would if you were engaging with an organization that can bring that solution and partner with you to figure it out. I think that's really important. We don't just want to throw you the fish. We want to teach you how to fish and figure this whole thing out, because you're the best at running your business, and we can help enable you from that solution perspective. Fair enough?
Absolutely. Fair enough. Absolutely.
Agreed. Well, thanks so much for joining us. First episode of 2023. We're glad you came to see us. We hope that you'll come back, and I hope that you guys will come back, Clay and Chris. It was a good time talking to you. Thank you so much. If you want to learn more about what we do here at Insight, please visit us at insight.com/solutions. Thanks for joining us.